Hello, it's Marcus here. Thanks for popping by. When I first heard about Bitcoin, I thought, it was just some toy with which some technologists invented so that they can experiment with it. I thought it was still very much experimental. So I didn't look much into it. And I think when it comes to Bitcoin, many of you are probably thinking along those same lines. What's the point of it? Why should it matter? And I agree, right? We need to have good reasons why we should even get involved in anything, let alone Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies. So today I'm going to talk to you about how and why I started taking Bitcoin seriously. I had this experience that made me understand the types of problems that Bitcoin might be able to solve. So if that sounds interesting to you, press the like button, subscribe to this channel, and stick around. In 2015, something happened that made me realize the types of problems that Bitcoin might be able to solve. I traveled to the Philippines for the first time since I left it when I was a teenager, 15 years before. Broadband internet was not commonplace. Telephone lines were never laid in most parts of the provinces where my relatives lived. This meant that when broadband internet came to us in the more developed nations, people in countries like the Philippines did not have access to any fast internet through DSL, ADSL, or fiber optic cables. Now, this struck me, right, because the internet changed my life and that of most people I knew. It altered industries, businesses, and workplaces. So knowing how important the internet was, I thought, okay, I'll pay internet access for one of the households. I thought that, even if it was for just one family, at least the other relatives can come and visit and access the internet should they have the need to send an email, look for work, study, maybe even do business, whatever. It's quite common in rural and provincial areas to share such resources, popping in and out of each other's houses to borrow items or use the only telephone line in the neighborhood was normal. And I expected to pay for the initial cost of installing the internet from wherever the cabling might come from. And there's also the cost of monthly access to the internet. So I thought, okay, it would cost me the equivalent of 40 Australian dollars a month, and all I'll need to do is to send the money monthly for them to pay for the internet. It sounded easy. Now the first question was, whose bank account should I transfer the payments? And as it turned out, none of my adult relatives, and there were about 100 of them in those hills and mountains, in that village, there were about 100 of them, and none of them had a bank account. They told me that it was too expensive to maintain a bank account. Banks had a lot of conditions. For example, if they did not hold a minimum balance, the banks would close the bank account. The minimum balance was relatively too high for them. It probably meant a month of their wages. And further, the monthly fees to keep their bank accounts open were also too high, too expensive. One of my relatives eventually told me that one of my nieces might actually have a bank account because she worked in a bank. The problem was she did not live in the same province. So someone had to take a bus that took about 5 hours to get there, to tell her what we were up to and get things sorted out. But then I found out that to transfer 40 Australian dollars to her, my bank in Australia would charge me 30 Australian dollars. So basically, if I wanted to transfer 40 Australian dollars, I would have to pay 30 Australian dollars. That's almost double. This experience demonstrated to me how a lot of the things that we in the more developed countries take for granted. I realized that my relatives and millions of others in the Philippines and around the world who were unlucky enough to have been born where they did were being left behind despite the technological and financial advancements made elsewhere in the world. I wanted to talk to my relatives about how I could help them build their websites so they could do business. But it no longer seemed practically relevant talking to them about e-commerce because they did not even have a bank account. And none of their potential customers would buy from them because they too did not have a bank account or a credit card with which to shop online. It was shortly after this experience when I was listening to a podcast and they were interviewing a man named Wences Casares, the CEO of a Bitcoin wallet provider named Xapo, Xapo. He also happened to sit on the board of PayPal. He grew up in Argentina and he witnessed how his grandparents and his parents, along with everyone else, needed to rebuild their fortunes multiple times after years of saving and building because their government kept failing the economy. They kept printing money and this kept devaluing their currency. And after each collapse, people had no choice but to try and rebuild again. But after a few years, their savings would once again be worth nothing, as the value of their currency plummeted because of hyperinflation. Now, it's sort of easy to hear these statements and just brush it away because it's hard to appreciate the extent that people suffer when they are in the unfortunate position to be living in a country experiencing hyperinflation. Here is a chart of Argentina's yearly inflation rate between 1970 and 1994. The first visible peak happened in 1976, when the inflation rate was 438%. This means that during that year, prices in general have risen 4 times. The next peak was between 1984 and 1985, when it was around 600%. Now, this is similar to you losing 85% of the value of the money you've got in your bank account in 1984. And the year after that, you would lose another 85% of your remaining 15%, leaving you with about 2.25 cents for every dollar you had saved. So if you've saved 100,000 by the end of 1983, you would only have 2,200 left to spend 2 years later. And the worst was in 1989, when the inflation rate was 3,046%. This is equivalent to you losing 97% of the money you've got in your bank account in 1 year. So if you managed to save 10,000 the year before, you would only have $330 left 12 months later. And you didn't touch your money. Now, what if you were saving that for an operation? If you happen to live in a country that does not have a supportive healthcare system? What if it was for your children's education? And if neither of those examples work for you, you can think about where you will stand if after working 1 year, the whole year, that's 52 weeks, and at the end of it, you will only get paid for 2 weeks. How are you going to survive? This situation of hyperinflation, it's not like it's just a one-off thing. It's actually happened 30 times, at least, in the last 100 years, around the world. And Mr. Casares understood that the problem he and his fellow Argentinians had was because of governments increasing their nation's money supply. So when he heard about Bitcoin, one thing that struck him and that appealed to him was the fact that the supply of Bitcoin is capped at 21 million. That's the way the software works. That's the way the network will enforce it. There can never be more than 21 million Bitcoins ever. And if a currency has a limited or fixed supply, then it cannot inflate. This means that people who own that currency will not have to worry about a group of politicians or a central bank devaluing their money by increasing its supply. So I've heard of Bitcoin years previously, but I never really took interest. I never really strained to think of how or why it could be important. But after what I've seen and experienced in the Philippines, and after listening to Mr. Casares' experience, it began to dawn on me that there could be more to Bitcoin than just a new technological toy. It seemed to me that whoever invented Bitcoin had given these massive issues a lot of thought. These issues like hyperinflation and the fact that our monetary system is not catering for the needs of those in developing countries. Perhaps Bitcoin is actually a serious and honest attempt by someone to try and solve these huge problems. At this point, we're going to pause and we'll leave the rest for future videos. I hope it had been helpful or informative somewhat. And in the next video, we'll take a look at the concept of money and the different forms it had taken in the past and present. So subscribe to this YouTube channel, it's called Trading Adventures, to be notified of the next video when it comes out. And in the meantime, you can visit us at marcuscomello.com to check out our latest trading signals and other updates. Thanks for joining me today. Until next time, bye.